Afternoon again, everybody. My name's Keith Kelleher, and I'm the chair for this afternoon's panel discussion on the management of increases in the construction cost arena. Something that's I'm sure dear to the hearts of everybody listening. I'm Keith Kelleher. I'm a chartered quantity surveyor. I'm the current vice chair of the SCSI ADR committee. And I'm here simply just to chair two excellent speakers that we have coming up after me this afternoon. Patrick King is just throwing up some polls in respect to just four quick questions that we wouldn't mind getting some feedback from everybody who's listening. So if you don't mind, it should be on the screen in front of you. If you wouldn't mind just partaking in that, and we'll have a look at what type of answers we get. I'd like to welcome everybody to this panel discussion. We're joined, as I said, by two speakers this afternoon who will discuss how they, I suppose, on both sides of the equation have responded to the recent increases in construction costs that we're all suffering and all hearing about on an ongoing basis. Each speaker will give a very short presentation, and then we're going to open up the floor basically for a Q&A. So I suppose the ethos of the panel discussion, it's not kind of telling everybody or giving anybody that definitive answer. It's more about trying to have that conversation, start the conversation about what's going on, what's happening at the moment, and what are kind of different people doing to deal with the cost increases that we're seeing in the industry. Okay, so so this is very much an engagement that we're looking for. It's very much, get involved. We have the Q&A function, we have the chat function. Please do jump in, ask any question at any time. We'll keep an eye on them, we'll pull them together, and we'll get as many questions answered as we can. So if you can, easier for me if everybody could use the Q&A function for any questions that they want. Feel free to ask it either in your own name or anonymously if you feel, and we'll, as I said, we'll move it on and get as many questions answered as we can. So first up, I'd like to introduce Marcus Cairn. So Marcus works for CISC. He's a passionate and ambitious construction professional, businessman and leader with over 20 years experience in the construction and engineering industry. He's experienced in a wide variety of projects under various forms of contract, procurement methods and contractual arrangements. Marcus is a leading figure in his chosen discipline through continuous training and education. His qualifications from the University of Queensland, Imperial College London and Cambridge University. And he's skilled in the art of negotiation, contract administration, and has substantial commercial acumen. Professionally educated in systems thinking and executive intelligence. So I'm going to hand over to Marcus, who's going to set the scene for what's going on in our industry at the moment. And then Marcus is then going to move on, discuss how CISC are dealing with this, and then we'll come back for our second speaker. So over to you, Marcus.
Thanks, Keith. Good afternoon to everybody, and thanks to the SCSI and to the chair for opening, creating this opportunity for today's session for what is without doubt probably a one-in-a-lifetime type experience for most of us in this industry. Certainly our CEO, Steve Bowcott, has said he used to go back to 1970 to remember a time when he would have seen inflation levels or activity of this type and volatility in our industry. So it's certainly an interesting moment for us all, particularly when we set that against the backdrop of what was the recent pandemic. And just when we thought something very difficult had been thrown at our industry, we're now faced with further consequences and the continuing ongoing effects of that manifesting itself in these challenges, which first probably looked from our perspective as if it was just an inflationary type pressure, but certainly we have as much difficulty with, if not more, in relation to the availability element. So I'm going to spend a few moments just maybe looking at this at maybe a bit of a more macro level. What do we think we're seeing as to what's going on, what might be driving with that? And then just share some insights as to the types of things we're doing to try and mitigate and manage the risk exposure that this presents for our business right across the group. So at that sort of macro level, unforeseen demand against the backdrop of the shutdown that happened globally from the pandemic. And unfortunately for Western Europe, particularly Ireland, probably one of the last to be exiting from that shutdown. We seem to be behind everybody in terms of them getting the first dibs back at the table to try and get products secured. We see lots of other industries, non-construction related industries, soaking up massive demands for materials. as a result of a just-in-time manufacturing philosophy probably not being able to withstand the consequences of a pandemic shutdown. So just in case type product management probably coming to the fore. Big companies, you see the big tech, pharma, the silicone type related industries putting massive orders and securing massive quantities of materials and just holding on to them, not actually turning them into finished products. So if you're able to trace, for any of you that are looking at it from this perspective, if you trace the production of raw material type products into finished product, there's a gap, which ultimately means somewhere in the world, people are stockpiling materials for their own needs and for their own goods, whether that is at a country level, from a government strategic direction point of view, or just big companies that have big buying power. Raw material shortages are starting to present themselves more and more. We look at something like, say, copper, for example. A bit of research we've done identifying that no copper mine has looked for an expansion in the last 18 months. No copper producer has looked to open a new mine in the last 18 months. And what that means is the point of time from, say, looking to open a copper mine to actually extracting copper out of it is about 8 years. The expansion of an existing mine is about 5 years. So we're already not being able to meet the demand of copper, a lot presented by the increase in green energy influences. Anything related to green energy seems to have an increased demand for copper. So we're already falling short of that, and that's only going to get worse. And no new mines or no expanded mines open up to meet that demand. So we're going to have continuing effect in terms of some of these material shortages. Other materials then might be a bit more temporary. When we think of timber and we look, say, what's happening from the likes of Scandinavia, increasing its timber exports by about maybe 1,300% to North America to react to the fiscal stimulus that the American government put in place. Again, things that people probably didn't necessarily predict, driving the price of timber out through the roof. But that should right itself, whether it's in 6 months' time or 12 months' time. But certainly it doesn't look like that's going to be something that will be around for 5 years. If we look on the left-hand side here, the global shipping crisis, very, very peculiar reaction to the pandemic, when effectively ports shut down and you end up with lots of containers, empty containers located in the wrong part of the world to keep that chain of flow happening. And so it's almost where low exporting countries, heavy importing countries have just lots of containers sitting there empty, and ships arriving empty just to pick up shiploads worth of empty containers to get them back, say, predominantly to Southeast Asia to get filled up again. And that's creating massive backlogs and simple little added on bits to that. Say the Suez Canal, they shut down, they thought that might be a 3-month thing, and maybe that could be 6 months, just clearing the backlog of that. We've been looking recently at the shipping element and studying where are shipping patterns moving to now. And in response to governments wanting to keep raw materials local to themselves, we're seeing a massive change in the pattern of shipping flows, and it seems to be Northern Europe is suffering the most from that. And some of you might be very well familiar with the statistics that's doing the rounds in our industry at the moment, saying 40-foot shipping containers haven't gone up about 550% year on year against the backdrop of this. So these are phenomena that probably 12, 18 months ago, we didn't think we would have to face into, coupled with the effects the pandemic have. They've all hit us hard. Michelle, if we could move to the next slide, please. So COVID, Brexit, they've had effects, and maybe Brexit didn't end up being as bad as what it could have been, but certainly created some issues for us. But definitely COVID and other global demand, other forces. So urbanization taking off like never before. The next 5 years, 8 years, predicted to have 10 more mega cities with more than 10 million people in them, including existing mega cities growing at a faster rate than that. That places a terrible demand on products and where they're going to be located. If you trace iron ore into steel finished product, Northern Europe only gets about 7% of that from a global perspective, whereas China gets just shy of 60% of that. If we think of Ireland in the context of that, what percentage of the 7% that we get? And we're probably only getting about a quarter or a third of 1%. So our ability to actually control some of these things is extremely difficult, which makes it more and more important that we actually do start to really understand what are the driving forces behind these things, so we can help both each other, within the industry and our clients make really informed decisions about when to actually make their next move, and should they be playing a defensive or an offensive strategy in that. We certainly, as either an industry or a country, we can't control a lot of these global phenomena, which makes it more and more important that we do actually understand what it is that's going on. To go to the next slide, please, Michelle. So some of the sort of things that we're looking at and trying to do to help inform the business and manage the situation. So I'm showing here a sample of a commodity price tracker dashboard that we've been running in the business now for about 12 months. We baselined all of these commodities against the 2019 position. Every month we match them or map them again against movements that we've been advised of, and we issue that information out to our business. So behind each of these commodity items, there's a detailed graph that would map what has happened, and where we do know what is likely to happen, the forecast is included. But more importantly for the people, what we do is we explain why these things are happening, so they can help them have informed conversations with their people and with their clients. And again, from the auspice of trying to make informed decision making, should we be accelerating procurement of supply chain activities? Should we be halting it temporarily and doing that in conjunction with our clients if we think the wind is going to change on some of these things? So we've set up a special task force at a centre level to cover the group across Ireland, UK, and its operations in Europe. And effectively, it's a research group consisting of 4 people who day on day are researching market activity for both future predictions as to what's going to happen, and more importantly, why. And then also looking at alternatives. Any crisis probably brings with it a high hope of innovation, and one of the things we can do is look to give alternative solutions to something. So whether that's moving from one product to a different product at a specification level, or moving from one material type to a different material type in conjunction with clients' design teams on a joint decision making. So we feel it's really important that we gain a full understanding of the supply chain dynamics and the outlook. So if you look at those icons at the top and on the extreme right hand side, and maybe up to a maximum of 2 steps to the left of that, has been typically where we've been operating for the past 10 years, due largely in part to the huge stability that was there in relation to commodity type items. So what our research group is now looking at is tracing all of those material types right back to its raw material state. And if you can recall that saying of when a butterfly flaps its wings, when does the tsunami occur? So we see the butterfly flapping his wings as the raw material, and the concurrent effect of that as to how it moves through these different stages, whether it's the shipping, the manufacturing, onward transportation, distribution, right up into the supply chain. You need to ensure that suppliers can clearly articulate the price increase. So I'm sure some of you may have witnessed and seen where people mistranslate material price increases and apply it to a much broader and larger thing. So we need to have really informed conversations with each other to make sure we are understanding this properly and we are passing it on. And that can be really difficult. It's understandable, but really difficult when you consider the backdrop of what we're sitting against. All of us having a really difficult year last year, continuing on into this year, and everybody will be feeling financial pain. So it's understandable why some people might want to see if there's a way to maybe help some of that recovery through this medium. But actually, we think it's far more important that we just have really open, really transparent conversations on this as to what is moving, or what is making these movements, what is the right movement, and then have those conversations with clients who equally will be experiencing this as quite a difficult thing. View unavoidable price increases as a temporary, not a constant. So if you look at the price of structural steel at the moment, based on the price of iron ore trading at its highest price ever, and for those of you that keep an eye on this stuff, you would have seen the major ore producers last night saying that they reckon a $200 plus iron ore level is here to stay for the next 18 months. How much of that is already built into the prices we all know today? That can be really hard where people are locked in on existing contracts, but it doesn't necessarily mean that these future increased growths are going to happen again and again. For some commodity items, that might already be built in. So it's important that we understand where that is for any commodity type, and so we can have that informed decision making going on. And then importantly, prioritize cross-functional initiatives. We can't do anything ourselves individually about these price increases. And what we can do is we can really drive a culture of innovation and look at alternative means and alternative ways of actually getting material types or assets built for our clients. And some of those decisions might actually be placing things on hold. Some will be using the different product types, and some of it hopefully will bring new inventions into our industry to make it an overall better place. Just by way of example, just to finish out here, some of the research we've done, if we consider something like steel, really important material type in our industry, we've gone back to try and understand what is it that goes on with the production of steel. So what is it with the iron ore? What is it with coking coal? When we look at those as performing commodities in the marketplace, do they have any interrelationship with each other? Does one drive another? Does one react to one another's behavior? So we've been studying that and trying to bring some correlation. When we think of the different steel manufacturing process of either blast furnace or electric arc, what is it that's happening where? So those percentage figures in blue is what the global stage is. 60% of steel that's manufactured is done by blast, 40% is by electric arc. But in the red, what you see there is what does that look like just from a purely European context. And so you can see a shift in the dimension there, a bit more blast furnace going on than there is electric arc. That's just manufacturing. Actually, if you see down on the bottom right hand side, what we're doing there is mapping where is all this manufacturing taking place. So although there's a lot less electric arc manufacturing process going on in Europe, actually some of you might be just buying your product from electric arc manufacturers, which then it has a much higher reliance on scrap metal. And little phenomena that are going on there. If you see the effect of the shutdown from the global pandemic, people didn't recycle second-hand cars as much as what is normal. So that has led to a shortage. About a third of the scrap metal that goes into electric arc comes from second-hand cars. So if they're not there and they're not being traded, then is that going to drive the price? And should we be looking to balance our load against both blast furnace manufacturers and electric arc manufacturers? However, again, when you look behind the veil of that, everybody would be familiar with the headline item from British Steel there a couple of weeks ago. They import most of their raw product in bulk into the UK, but if shipping is happening by weight as opposed to by volume, we're all familiar with the 550% figure, but bulk commodity shipping is probably around 350%. So again, it is important that we get behind all this stuff, get ourselves into an informed position and make really informed decisions jointly with our clients and in the protection of our own companies to protect the bottom line. So that's just a bit of an insight as to what we're doing. I'll hand back to Keith and Bryn, and hopefully they'll give us some further insights from their perspective.
Marcus, thank you very much. It's fascinating and frightening all at the same time in terms of the level that I suppose companies are having to go to in terms of research, you know, and to protect their own businesses in regard to what's going on. So it's a fascinating insight. So thank you very much for that. Our next contributor is Bryn Griffiths. Bryn is the Director of Cost Management in Turner & Townsend's Dublin office. Leads the delivery of a variety of schemes within the residential and commercial sectors. He has over 20 years experience providing client-focused support and advice. Bryn's experience includes residential, commercial and mixed-use developments for major developer clients. Bryn also has a focus on people, leading people through the APC process as an APC assessor, and he's a mentor for the RICS and for the SCSI. So I'll hand over to Bryn, who's going to give just a short presentation in respect to what Turner & Townsend are doing in respect to the advices and stuff that they're giving to their private clients.
Thanks, Keith, and thanks to Marcus for the detailed analysis there. So I think probably I won't focus too much on all of the sort of raw material and issues going on. That obviously is key to the situation we're in at the minute, but just a bit of background in terms of how we saw things coming into 2021. Having seen last year being fairly flat in terms of tender price inflation, you know, we do market research twice a year with a group of contractors of various sizes, just in terms of where they see different things moving in the market. And coming into 2021, the view was still very much that there was a high level of competition for the projects that were coming forward, and that would sort of keep prices probably flat to moderate this year, but there was some expectation that sort of within the back end of 2021, perhaps as we came out of the pandemic and with the news of the vaccines coming through and things, that there would be an uptake perhaps towards the end of the year. And then I think it's fair to say the first sort of couple of tender prices we got back within 2021, we started to see some spikes and started to look into what was happening, and certain materials, particularly steelwork in the early part of the year, we're seeing jumps the likes of which most of us hadn't seen. So we started a bit like Cisco just talked through to sort of reach out to the market and see what was happening, and starting to track the changes to the different materials and try and understand the background of them, and then quickly had to try and translate that into what impact that was going to have on our clients' projects, with a particular focus probably on the schemes that were coming close towards going out to tender, and being able to try and have a good conversation and give some good advice about where those tender prices might land as a result of everything that was happening. So we reached out to several of our clients that we were at that kind of stage with, and sort of took the project apart, if you like, and stripped it back to its sort of material elements, and then looked at all the different impacts of the various material price increases we were seeing reported, to try and understand, what impact that actually has on a potential tender price coming back. So purely just looking at the material impact, we did it on various projects, but then we sort of pulled this together into a sort of generic steel framed building, whether that's an office or a distribution type unit, to see what the impact was. So in a steel frame building, if steelwork's up by 50% in its sort of supplied form, the analysis we did was sort of saying that was around a 2.5% impact on the bottom line. We did that also looking at various other things. So the other things, MEP, a lot of the individual materials and things that go into all the systems, we're all seeing various increases. So that was probably the second highest impact at about 2%, and then dropping down through glazing and cladding and concrete at slightly lower percentages. But what we were seeing on a sort of fairly typical generic building basis was that could impact the bottom line, or the tender price, by about 10%. Just moving on, that is purely the material side of things. I think then we had to engage with the market and see what potential tenderers' views were on the market and the pricing. Will they continue to increase? And then other things sort of started to come to light. So where we had public clients, the kind of conversations we were having to have was that they might find a drop off in tenders. The sort of fixed price nature of the public works contract, and a perceived sort of lack of flexibility of public bodies to be able to deal with sudden shocks and changes in the market, meant that the feedback we were getting suggested that people either wouldn't be interested in tendering for public works, or if they were going to tender, that the potential risk of continued material price increases would certainly be reflected in tender prices. So we had to discuss with clients that they would potentially see significantly higher prices than perhaps were expected, sort of going back 6 months ago. We were seeing, people were going to be picking and choosing, I think, the contractors, which projects they were going to tender for. Certainly schemes that looked more straightforward, lower sort of perception of risk on them, would be more appealing. So that you might find a drop off in tenderers. And they were also considering start on site. So, tenders going out in the second quarter of this year that might have been starting this summer were seen as being incredibly risky, with the potential material prices continuing to increase. compared with projects that maybe were scheduled for start on site at the back end of this year or the start of 22, where, as Marcus mentioned, that there is some expectation that certain material elements will sort of settle back down. So, you know, that might give tenderers the option to sort of take a bit of a view as to where it might be by the time they're actually procuring their materials. And it also sort of became clear that you know, if people in the market had an appetite for your particular project, you know, if it was something that filled a gap in the portfolio that the tenderer was looking for, that, you know, that would encourage perhaps a different approach to be taken, or, you know, more of a careful view to be taken. So sort of pulling all that together, we were having conversations with clients around how to perhaps best navigate the current situation. I think, you know, no denying that prices have increased rapidly in the first half of this year, but what could they do to try and sort of minimize the impact of it? So, and I mean, some of this is just good procurement advice anyway, but a really high quality engagement with the market and potential tenderers for projects, and identifying which tenderers are really keen on your particular project, and making sure that you've got a tender list of people that are really wanting to win that particular piece of work. What could be done to reduce the perceived risk level of the project? So if there's a potential opportunity to carry out some enabling works outside of a main contract tender, whether that's demolition, site clearance, service diversions, perhaps bulk dig, even to leave the site clear of some of the initial risks, that would increase the appetite for work. The dual benefit of that being you might also delay the tender date for the main contract works back to the latter half of this year, where again perhaps there'd be a bit more certainty around some of the material pricing, and you know, might see some of those prices coming off. So that's, I mean, that's a sort of summary of the insights we came to. We've again, a bit like Marcus was saying, we've a group within our office that are monitoring this. It is something that's moved rapidly and changed rapidly, certainly in the first half of this year, and continues to need to be watched. I think, you know, we're all kind of looking to see where the overall position might reach by the end of this year. But I think, you know, that will be a sort of moving feast as we go through the year. But I think the important point is quality conversations, making sure clients are aware of the situations and the potential pitfalls, and what their options are to try and minimize the impact.
Thank you very much, Brent. Again, it is very interesting, I suppose, to see how we're all having to kind of deal with these things on the move. I'm going to ask Bryn, Marks, you both have your cameras back on, which is great. We're going to jump into the, you know, an element of a Q&A. As we said at the outset, what we're trying to spark is a conversation. It's not, you know, a definitive answer where there's nobody here, you know, with the crystal ball or the magic wands that's going to be able to give everybody the answers. But we want to open that conversation. As I said, please do jump in and throw any question you have into the Q&A box. I think just interestingly, if we just look at the poll results in regard to the 4 questions that I know Patrick threw up at the start, and I don't know if Patrick can show them. He can. So, you know, some interesting results coming in. It's pretty much across the board. The high percentage of people are feeling, you know, that increase. They're feeling materials increased. And when you look at the poll, that in excess of 50, what is it, nearly 70% of people are you know, feeling in excess of 10% costs on their projects, which is, you know, which is a substantial issue no matter what project you're on. If we move down a percentage of contract value, again, the higher percentage of people are again feeling the you know, the 5 to 10 to 11% plus impact on their overall projects. The material that's killing everybody, and it's, I suppose it's no great surprise that timber's coming out, you know, fairly high on that list. But steel obviously is the main concern for people. Insulation following up. M&E, which I suppose was surprisingly, it's something I see myself. you know, having a substantial hit on most of our projects would be the M&E. So again, you know, that's been replicated. And I think the concerning one for all of us, and which is why we're having debates like today, is I suppose when 66% of people, you know, listening to this webinar believe that contractors in effect may have issues continuing on projects within the next 6 months, you know, it just starkly, I kind of puts it in front of us as to what we're here talking about and what we're dealing with. So, you know, so they're interested. You know, there's 120 odd people listening to us today. So it's just to give an idea as to where we're coming from. So okay, I'm going to open the ball rolling with a question. I'm going to throw the question at Marcus just because he's still on the screen in front of me. We hear this term hyperinflation, and you know, it's anyone working on public works contracts will probably, the word hyperinflation is the only avenue. People see it as this only avenue to make a claim for a price variation in the public works contract. Hyperinflation, have we reached it? What is it?
So look, it's interesting that the PwC form of contract in particular has a very clear definition from its perspective as to what hyperinflation is. Something not to be confused with, as we read in media statements, in publications, etc., that word might be just bandied about quite loosely. So against the backdrop of the PwC, it's a very clear formulaic type approach. It's a number that's quite high. I think most people would probably accept that it's not there. Question is will it be there at all? It's quite a high bar that has to be overcome. You'd be looking at sort of an over-cumulative piece over a year, 1,000%. I think none of the commodities have quite got there. So then what is this? It's certainly extraordinary. It's certainly large, and it's certainly something that most people, if anyone, could have foreseen. We contemplated running a job application for a Mystic Meg type profile and didn't get many responses. So definitely people, contractors in particular, probably are suffering from this. Our supply chains are suffering from that. Under the public works form, it's quite hard at the moment to go anywhere with that. If people remind themselves back to the earlier part of our presentation here today, what is it people can connect dots on in terms of maybe a COVID related or a force majeure type related matter? What are the avenues that are open to people? I'm probably keen to avoid probably giving contractual advice in that sense, but hyperinflation, not by the definition of the contract, but is it something extraordinary? And when we think of our private contract portfolio, certainly when we're sitting with those clients, that is exactly the conversation we're having. We're describing a phenomenon that both parties and the supply chain as well couldn't have foreseen. And how do we collectively, as a group, work our way through this? Because it's difficult, and nobody wants the consequence of this to be the supply chain or contractors failing. So the question is, what can we do as a collective to work our way through this for something that hopefully is temporary? Also, what I'd probably just highlight to people momentarily is, what if this isn't temporary? What if this is another super cycle event? There has only been 5 in the last 100 years. And for those people that are not familiar with the term super cycle, it's a phenomenon that is bigger in terms of scale and lasts longer than just an extraordinary cyclical event, of which commodities are quite famous for. We normally go to work hoping that across a group of commodities, the ups and downs even themselves out. But if everything remains elevated in a super cycle world, which could be 3, 4, 5 years, what do we do as an industry about that?
Thank you, Marcus. Brian, I don't know if you can add to that.
I think Marcus covered the issue there, that the kind of definitions, the fixed price clauses on the public works contract certainly don't cater for this. And whilst the RIAI in its raw form would certainly have a clause that would appear to deal with this, in most instances that is crossed through and the contract is entered into as a fixed price. So from a contractual construction contract point of view, probably most contractors would find themselves in a situation where the contract itself doesn't deal with a situation like this.
Yeah,
but then you're into
just picking up on that, we have a question just coming in specifically contract related, so I'll just throw it up there, and Marcus or Brian, please do jump in. But as a subcontractor, the price fluctuation clause is always struck out by main contractors. Any suggestions in terms of getting around this, and is this typically the case from main contractors to clients also?
I think it is. I mean, certainly, as we'd see, most contracts that are entered into have that clause removed, and I'd suggest that that's why it's back to back then with the subcontracts.
Yeah. Okay. Just taking, I suppose, when we look at contracts, and when we look at material price increases, we're looking at it nearly from 3 different seats. I suppose it's the seat of people who are tendering projects, the people who are already on contracts, and then that middle gap of people who have tendered but haven't signed a contract yet. I suppose just to throw the question out there, if you're contracting a job, and I had a contractor who only rang me yesterday in respect to seeking advice for a contract that he has already tendered, but the contract won't commence on site for 15 months. How should we be looking at things like that? What type of things should we be looking out for? And I might throw that at you, Brian, if that's all right.
I think, you know, the kind of conversations we've been having with the contracting market, you know, there is a view that whilst this is an event that's happening right now and will certainly be impacting during the middle of this year, that there will be some return or drop off in prices of certain materials as some of these issues, which are short-term issues, supply issues, whatever, sort of start to work their way out. So to some degree, I mean, the people I've been speaking with, if the project was starting in 12 months' time, I think they'd feel more comfortable about the pricing levels than they would if they were starting in the short term. But I mean, that is a very long period of time from a tender submission to a start on site. So that in itself is something that tenderer would have to dealt with in terms of the potential risk. But as I mentioned, the view, if they tendered for that in the early part of this year, the view as to where the world would be was very different to where it is now. Certainly, I think we're expecting to see that where tenders are submitted at the minute, the fixed price offering of them will be shortened. But obviously, if you've already submitted a tender, that's too late. But I think that's something we're expecting to have to watch out for, that they will be coming with quite a short fixed price period on them.
And I suppose, Mark, is just kind of asking the same question in a different way. You know, when or will we, in your view, hit a wall? Like, when is that point where this becomes, you know, we had a poll up there where 66% of the people who are listening believe that contractors won't be able to, the contractors that they have currently won't be able to continue if this is still going on in 0 to 6 months' time. So, you know, that is the wall. When, in your view, or when will we hit that wall?
Yeah, so look, my own view, and certainly not the companies in any shape or form. My own view would be that it's at least that. Certainly, the research we're doing and what we're seeing would lend itself towards that. It's quite horrible to hear statements last night when people are sort of saying the highest price of iron ore ever is going to last for another 18 months. So it's difficult. Now, we must remember though, what of that is baked in. What conversations can we have with our clients and our supply chains, and does everybody fully appreciate it and understand that? Because it's the conversation piece that's going to be more important. I feel for that person who's been asked to give something for 15 months out, because they can't possibly have it right. If they do get it right, please let us know, because you've got a special talent. But what we can do is just have really, really informed conversations. Nobody should bet the farm. And people should very much protect themselves, and the people we rely on to inform us of those decisions, the supply chains, the manufacturers, etc. How well do they understand this, and how well are they passing that information on to us? Because it's probably easier for everybody one step removed to walk away. So you go back to that concept of an iron ore producer. Well, they don't care. The steel manufacturer, they probably care a little less. The steel distributor, we're getting closer to ourselves at that stage, so they'll hold their feet to the fire a small bit. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't work for them, they'll still turn around and say, oh, I got it wrong, I can't stand over it. And if you're in contract, you're in that awful position then where you're somewhat left carrying the can. So the more joined up and open conversations people can have, which is a little more difficult in the public space. I'd argue maybe not impossible, but certainly more difficult. But certainly if you're operating in a private world capacity, have as many conversations with as many people as often as you can, and keep this dialogue open. One of the very strong views we would have as an organisation at the moment is there doesn't seem to be many people talking about this. Is that because they're not feeling it? Is that because they're so worried and they're so confused about it that they don't know how forums like today really help this conversation to come to life? And people should be feel stronger and more informed to have those conversations.
Just again, there's a question, and there's a couple of questions there, and I'm going to come back to one of them in a moment. But raising the issue of risk sharing, and you know, are we at a point where we have to have that adult conversation again? Like I remember being involved in a dispute recently where one party was claiming, you know, under clause 36 of the RAI for price variation, and in a meeting the other party said that went out with the, you know, with the ages. Nobody has claimed for that in years. That was just a mistake. That clause wasn't struck out. There's a question come in on risk sharing to a degree, you know, within the prelims, or is there not another means in which it's possible to include an escalation clause to take into account material cost increases, specifically to deal with uncertainties that we're now experiencing? As we all know, that is there. It's clause 36 in the RAI. Okay, the public works is a different kettle of fish, but I suppose, Bryn, if I throw the question at yourself, are we at a point where we have to be adults and start having that conversation that clause 36 no longer has the big red line through it?
I think, I mean, there's obviously, we've just discussed the impact of the price increases on contractors and when it gets to a point where they can't afford to continue building projects. But equally, on the client side of the table, viabilities are tight already, and getting projects away and getting them to work is already tricky. So so there's two sides to that sort of unaffordability. So we might hit a point where projects aren't brought forward because the appraisal just doesn't stack up. I suppose where you might open up the question around risk sharing is if you were finding that you weren't getting tenders coming forward, or you weren't getting tenders coming forward at a manageable level. So that's where perhaps a conversation between client and contractor around sharing that risk, so you get a realistic starting price, but an agreement between the two parties to monitor that within a framework during the life of the contract. But again, I think, you know, that opens up the question whether partway through the contract, if the materials are escalating rapidly, does the job end up stopped because it's not proven viable? So it's a tricky tightrope of a situation, I think.
And throwing that over to you then, Marcus, in terms of the same question, I suppose, what's the, you know, perceived, not necessarily the CISC view, but the contractor view in respect to risk sharing down the supply chain at the moment?
Yeah, so look, continuing on Breen's thought process there, risk share has to be a key component of how we move forward. But when we consider risk share, it's got to be considered from all dimensions. So risk share should include both on the up and on the down, which would mean we would have to have baseline points agreed on certain commodity types. Would be one way to do it. I think when does it become unviable for all parties? We must remember the client in this. So termination for convenience type provisions in contracts that allows everybody to walk away peacefully and somewhat unharmed if it gets too out of control. So these are things that really need to be considered properly in an open and mature type conversation way. Because the only way through this will be everybody staying with their feet at the table and inputting to create solutions to this. It can't be just a pass through in any one direction, whether that's upstream or downstream. It's got to have an element of sharing in it. That's going to be really hard on contracts that are on foot at the moment, but has to be really considered for contracts as we move forward. Not impossible for the contracts on foot, it just makes it a bit harder to overcome the obstacle.
Interestingly, I suppose when we've spoke, you know, we had our conversation leading up to this panel discussion. We've put a series of polls up on the screen, and we've all focused on the material. And you know, the heading for this panel discussion was the management of increases in construction cost. And I suppose we've played to the media to a degree, in that all of our discussion has focused on material. So interestingly, we've two questions that have popped up, which have nothing to do with material, and it will be interesting to get the panel's views. So I suppose one of the questions is, can I ask what the views are in regard to labour costs in the short to medium term? And a similar question in regard to labour shortages across all levels being a concern, and do we see, you know, will we start to see this improving or not? So I don't know, Bryn or Marcus, given that we had spent so much time preparing for material, who would like to jump in there?
I think I don't mind jumping in to start. I think the reason the focus is on material is that's been a particular event in the sort of first half of this year. I think the labour situation is one not just unique to Ireland, but this is a situation happening across the world in construction. The labour force is ageing, and you've got more retiring than you've got joining the industry on an annual basis. So the kind of labour shortages have been an ongoing trend and a worsening trend in the last few years. Having said that, I appreciate that the COVID lockdown, the start of this year, saw a lot of people leave Ireland and go to countries like the UK or elsewhere in Europe where construction wasn't locked down. And I guess the big question for all of us is, will any of those people be tempted to return back to Ireland? And if they do, presumably that comes at a premium. You know, why would they come and work here versus staying and working wherever they are currently? So I think it is an issue that's running alongside the material, and certainly one of concern right now.
And Marcus, I don't know, have we any wonderful stats in the same manner as we have in material?
Yeah, look, our modelling is certainly predicting that it's going to get worse, not better. Unfortunately, people probably won't want to hear that, but the shortage is going to increase. And like any law of economics, then if there's a shortage, the price is going to go up. We have to be mindful of people probably repurposing themselves. The latest labour returns and the CSO stats will probably show shortly the greatest movement of people across industries. And so whilst there may be some people attempting to fill that gap by making themselves available, are they skilled in the right way? Do they have the right experiences? So people probably want to keep their eyes open for that if something that is scarce becomes available a bit too quickly, is it the right answer? And then what are the alternative means of going to work that can reduce labour? And certainly offsite manufacturing has a massive place to play a role in helping improve the impact of this problem, and how well can we look to that and create more and more opportunities for offsite manufacturing. Do people, particularly after the pandemic and having time to experience life in a different way, do they want something different from their working environment? And how pleasant is it anymore to think of that person that has to stand out in the snow tying steel, for example, or would they much prefer to be doing that in a heated warehouse in a controlled environment? And what would that look like?
I think from a point of view of sorry, Keith, just from a point of view of attracting people into the industry, the younger generation, you know, something that is more high-tech, technology-based, you know, in a clean, safe environment, is going to be more likely to bring people into the industry. So I think there's definitely, that is one of the only ways we can tackle the ongoing labour issues.
Yeah, and it leads on to a question that's just come in. What are the alternative materials or forms of construction being considered to try and avoid the particular market increases? And I suppose, Marcus, you touched on it in your presentation in regard to this opportunity for innovation, I suppose, in process, in thinking, in manufacture. You know, like, are we realistically in Ireland, are we realistically set up for that? Or is it more an ideology that only big, you know, some of the big blue chip companies are the big, you know, the big sites where, you know, where the multiple of units are there to make these things work? Like, is it realistically an option for the industry as a whole?
I think the first thing that has to happen is a broader industry conversation has to take place to introduce flexibility into our designs and into our specifications to allow for alternatives. Most people will recall a couple of years ago the introduction of the plastic pipe for internal distribution of water to compete with the copper, and the fittings failed, and insurers weren't overly keen. So we diverted away from it and we went back to copper. If copper is going to go where people predict it's going to go, so it's at $9,500 a ton at the moment, people are predicting anywhere between $15,000 to $20,000 a ton. We have to fix that problem. We have to get a fitting that doesn't break and doesn't work. And so it's incumbent upon the industry as a whole. And I don't think any one person, I don't think the smaller companies or the smaller projects can do that on their own. Unless the industry turns its mind to this as a collective, we won't get there. But the consequences, as Bryn was alluding to there a while ago, if we don't get there, clients can't afford to do certain of these things. We've got to make it possible to be able to keep our industry going. And that can only, for a crisis of this size and nature, can only come from a collective, and it will only come through innovation.
I mean, we've more COVID related than the sort of material issue, but you know, the projects we've got where we were using precast systems and podded bathrooms during that last lockdown, all of that construction work continued to happen in the factories, and it's meant that the impact of that lockdown isn't just the straight impact of the however many 12 weeks or whatever we were closed for, because a lot of material was taken to a fairly complete form, and the construction has happened quite quickly afterwards. So the benefits were very stark to be seen there of moving this way, but it does need an industry shift. It comes right back, as Marcus said, to people like the insurers and the people that buy and own the buildings and operate them to be comfortable with modern technologies and different systems, so that then it can work its way down through the supply chain. So that, you know, there's a process there.
And look, we've time for another few questions. You know, we have loads of time. We can finish, you know, any time after 2, but it looks like we might, you know, get this wrapped up around the 2 o'clock. But please feel free to throw in. We do have time for another couple of questions. But I suppose just taking the idea of the conversation, and you know, why are we not having this conversation? Like, we're here on a panel discussion, but outside of everybody reading the newspapers, you know, and timber companies highlighting increases here, or, you know, specific parts of the industry having articles in newspapers, why as an industry are we not having this kind of, what is a seriously concerning conversation? I go back again, 66% of the people listening believe that contractors will have to stop working in 6 months if this isn't resolved. Just, you know, throwing it out there, why are we not having the conversation?
I wonder, is there fatigue after setting in following the pandemic, or are people tired? Typically when people are tired, they mightn't be thinking as hard, and although they can see this and feel it, have they got the energy to push and go again? And I think nobody would have wished for or hoped for this to be an outcome from the shutdown and from the pandemic. And if we think of the energies people and companies, both in an emotive state and a financial state, had to consume to get through the pandemic, is there the drive to go at this again hard? Because it takes effort and it takes time. We've had to take 4 people from their day job and repurpose them into this space. They didn't necessarily want to do that, and certainly the company would prefer that they were doing something that might be more contributing to the bottom line. But we look at this as defense of the bottom line. So we've got to approach this with energy again. We have to go at it again, and forums like this help to energize people to mobilize around it. Maybe that's what it takes, a bit of this just to kickstart it.
And Bryn, just to throw a question that's come in, does the panel long term foresee Ireland becoming uncompetitive in the construction for investment, and with short-term material price increases aside, which won't be reduced anytime soon, labour rates for tradesmen and wages for professionals are continually going through the roof?
Again, I think it's easy for us to look at this as an Irish issue, but I mean, the same trends are happening elsewhere. There is a concern that there are projects out there that are struggling to prove viability at current prices. So certainly increases in those prices won't help that situation. But I don't believe it's unique to. I think we've got a set of circumstances potentially right now that have impacted us, being an island and being so closely linked with the UK and Brexit. But I think, as we sort of said, those issues people have adapted to quite quickly, and perhaps don't appear to be impacting costs as significantly as maybe we all worried it would. So I don't know if I have the sort of the silver bullet, the answer to that one, but I think yes, costs are continually increasing, but I believe that's happening. We're seeing that across the globe currently. I think our concern at the minute is how sticky the pricing will be. We tend to see this, that prices will go up very quickly when issues happen, and come down very slowly. And so a bit like Marcus is saying, if the iron ore prices stay for 18 months where they're currently at, or even go higher, then we are going to have some significant issues. I think, when this first happened, people were thinking it would come down perhaps a little bit quicker than that, and that 6 to 9 months we might be just down at a more recognizable level than we are currently. So I think it's going to come down to that, whether things do come back down, and if they do, how quickly they come back down as to where we'll be on viability.
I suppose, Marcus, I'll just pass that question over to yourself, just in terms of from the contractor perspective and competitiveness. What's the short to long term?
Trying to maybe put a bit of a positive light on this, just remind people that pre-pandemic times, certain commodities were at their all-time lows as well. And so as we come down, we'll probably come back to a norm rather than to the lows of pre-pandemic. So that means we can certainly get ourselves into that viable range, but certainly really strong view that the way through this and the way out of it will be through innovation. If we stand still, we'll be the victims of it. If we hope someone else is going to do it for us, that isn't going to work either. We're going to have to, as an industry, innovate our way out of this.
And I have a question just come in, and it's directed at Marcus. Is Marcus of the view that the Irish construction tender market can stabilise somewhat based on current information and adjust for risk in tenders?
Stabilise, I don't think so at the moment, because I think if people are still on a learning curve of understanding this, they'll have a different view of it from that risk perspective. So if somebody is relying on a supply chain that says nothing's wrong and everything's fine, they'll obviously be extremely competitive in comparison to somebody who takes a very scientific, calculated assessment of this, which may have what might be perceived by others then as an inflated number. So the stabilisation, I think, is only going to come from discussions like this, where people are aware and they are in a place where they can have more informed discussions and decision making.
Yeah. I think that's a fair point, and I think we're expecting to see quite a wide range of tender returns. That's something we've been trying to prepare our clients for, that you won't see prices back within a nice tight range like maybe you used to, that you will see quite a broad range coming back, and I think Marcus has just nailed why that will be.
Yeah, and I suppose, Marcus, and you might be able to answer this, given I know you touched on saying that this is the 5th kind of super event, let's call it, but just a question has come in. The last time this happened in the 70s, has any research been done to analyse how long it took to adjust itself back? My employer did similar research and came up with the first quarter 2022.
Yeah, so probably frustratingly for people, the people that do specialise in this space, and I'm certainly not one of them, are saying that it'll be at least 12 to 18 months before they can officially call if we're in a super cycle, which probably would mean if they do call it, then we're 2 years into it, and it might be a 5-year event. So that's extremely frustrating for people trying to plan around it. If this is just an extraordinary cyclical event, i.e. it's a bit higher and it goes for a bit longer than the average couple of months type thing, then certainly what that contributor has put in there is possible. However, I'm not there at the moment. I don't see enough indicators to say we will be out of this in a way that we can move forward and live with normally by the first quarter of 2022. I think we're in for a difficult 2022. I'd encourage people to get somewhat prepared for that and get themselves to the best informed position and take whatever defensive or offensive strategies they need to cope with that. But I think 22 will be choppy.
Well, look, we're in a position to let people go back to work or enjoy the sunshine. So we've no other questions outstanding. So I'll just throw, I suppose, the last thing at each of you, and I'll start with Bryn. Let Marcus have a break for a second. But what's the final takeaways we take from, you know, starting this conversation today? Just, you know, where do we go from here? What do we need to start looking at?
I think you know, the takeaway from our side is that in a situation like this, quality conversations and the strength of relationships between people in the industry is needed. You know, from PQS side of the table, you know, with my hat on, to really get under the bonnet and understand what's happening in the market, and to be able to discuss that with the likes of Marcus and other people at other contractors, and really understand where the situation is, means that I can have good conversations with my clients. And you know, we've got to try and steer through a situation like this as an industry. So I think that's a really important part of it. And then as an industry, look to how we can innovate, as Marcus has referred to several times, to try and best navigate through the situation without the whole industry just sort of going into a halt under unmanageable cost increases.
And Marcus?
Yeah, look, I really rowing behind that. It's really important that we support each other. This isn't a time to be competitive or even anti-competitive. There's a lot of work that we all need to do to be in the best informed position on this. Share it, whatever information people have, share it, support each other, have informed conversations that are respectful both of the contracts we're in and of the future opportunities, because they might be two different types of conversations, but do it in the guise of supporting each other. It's really important that we get through this. It's temporary in some guise, whether that's quarters or numbers of years or quarters of years, and it'll settle, and we'll be back on an even keel at some point. We just have to hold each other together to get through that.
Thank you both. Fascinating insights, I suppose, into what the rest of us just reading papers and don't, I suppose, get under the bonnet. So it is a fascinating insight. So look, we've answered all the questions. So look, can I take the opportunity to thank Michelle Smith and Patrick King and the SCSI in the background, keeping us all going. Bryn Griffiths of Turner and Townsend, Marcus Cairn of CISC. Thank you very much. As I said, wonderful insights. Thank everybody for logging in, for the engagement throughout, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Keith.